Recently, Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace. Then Estonia, Finland, Denmark, even Germany. But why now? Is Russia sending a warning? Testing NATO? Trying to distract from Ukraine? Today, we're talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, these airspace incursions, and what it all means for the future of the West, transatlantic security, and the relationship between the United States and Europe. To discuss this, I sat down with Charles Kupchan from the Council on Foreign Relations and Constanze Stelzenmüller from the Brookings Institution. I'm Leslie Vinjamori, President and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and welcome to Deep Dish. Charlie and Constanze, I know you both spend a considerable amount of time in Europe. Constanze, you are from Germany. You've just returned, so you bring a tremendous perspective. Maybe I'll come to you first, Charlie, on the war and where we are. When President Trump was coming into office, there was a promise that this war would end quickly. And as we've seen over several months, that aspiration has not come to fruition. How would you depict the state of the war right now? And what surprises you, if anything?
Well, if you did a snapshot of the war today and compared it to a snapshot of the war before Trump took office, they wouldn't look that different. The war continues to rage on. Russia continues to chip away at the front line in eastern Ukraine. Russia has actually increased the pace, air attacks, drone attacks, and ballistic missile attacks on cities and infrastructure and civilian targets. And then the Ukrainians are using various kinds of creative innovations to increase the pain to Russia, in particular, using long-range strikes of various sorts to hit arms depots, to hit energy facilities, oil depots in particular, have carried out a few very high-profile attacks on Russian air bases. But there really hasn't been a fundamental shift in the dynamic. I would say the biggest changes that we've seen here in Washington are twofold. One is that, as you put it, Leslie, Trump has been trying to use diplomacy to end the war. It hasn't been very strategic. It's been chaotic, but an effort is being made, and it's an effort that I think was overdue. I think it was a mistake for Biden to just continue this war. And even though he said this is a war that will end at the negotiating table, there was no real strategic dialogue between the United States and Russia. And it's good in my mind that Trump and Putin are talking and that at least there is a diplomatic dialogue, even though it hasn't gone anywhere. And I think the other big change is that my sense is the Trump administration has a very different view of this conflict. In many respects, it doesn't attach to the war in Ukraine the same strategic importance that the Biden administration does. You hear people, including Vance and others, say this isn't really a war that has an immediate impact on American interests. And that's dramatically different because I think the Biden administration saw Ukraine as, and I'm almost quoting here, the front line in the battle for the liberal order and the battle for democracy. I think we're now in a kind of fluid point. And in my mind, unless Trump agrees to increase the pressure on Putin through economic sanctions and through the flow of increasing arms to Ukraine, we're just going to see more of same. Because I think that Putin thinks that he can win. And by win, I mean break Ukraine. And the goal here, if we're going to get a diplomatic end, is to give Ukraine what it needs to convince Putin that he's not going to break Ukraine.
Constanze, let me come to you. Do you agree broadly with what Charlie has laid out? Do you have a different interpretation? And could you especially weigh in on this claim that Charlie has made that it was good, that there's talking now? We know for a long time there weren't negotiations. But where for you, how do you capture the state of the war now, and on this question of the movement towards talks, good or bad?
The talks about talks, which is, I think, all that we've seen, they have, I think, conclusively demonstrated the accuracy of the assessment of the Ukrainians and many of the Europeans that the Russians have no intention of negotiating. That, as Charlie said, the Russians think that they are winning, that a war of attrition and time work in their favor. I think that's a proposition that we can disprove. But I think that the diplomatic efforts have so far produced a dead end, no result whatsoever. And all the talk about a reassurance force, a European interposition force of whatever nature, was only ever premised on the possibility of a ceasefire. That ceasefire is not on offer from the Russian side. So we can set aside the endless conversations about the nature of an international interposition force and focus on the two goals that I think are central to Ukrainian and to European security, which is one, helping Ukraine defend itself, and two, making quite sure that Putin becomes convinced that he cannot split Europe and distract it away from the mission of supporting Ukraine. Now, you will probably have noticed that there are a couple of things that I haven't said here. I think at this point it's moot to talk about the nature of winning and of victory and territorial concessions and whatnot. I think right now the point is, for the foreseeable future, I'm afraid, is of making it clear to Russia that we will not be distracted. And I think that we can do that, in fact. The other ancillary goal here is that we Europeans have, I think, now all come to the conclusion, especially after Alaska and the follow-on meeting in Washington, that we have a binary choice in transatlantic relations, which is either submitting to a chaotic transition of the burden of protecting European security from America to Europe, or of persuading the Trump administration that it is in their interests, and including in their pecuniary interests, their financial interests, to help us achieve a managed transition in which we buy time to support Ukraine by buying strategic enablers from the United States and gearing up our own defense industrial base. That is the choice that we have. Again, I believe nothing else is on offer, at least in this current moment and from this administration. And it might be that way with a subsequent administration or even a subsequent Democratic administration. In other words, we have seen a fundamental change of the nature of the transatlantic relationship that I currently do not see a reversal to an old and possibly idealized previous status quo, which in any case was never a status quo, but always dynamic.
Charlie, let me ask you about this. Constanze sort of laid out a strategy or a sort of choice that would see the U.S. help kind of stay the course. But is there a risk that the war in Ukraine for America and for Americans just becomes a background condition? Donald Trump tried, he failed, and he's kind of shifted his focus to where he thinks he can land a win. And that this, from America's point of view, no longer has the urgency or the potential for success, and so it becomes Europe's problem?
We're all going to speculate here because figuring out what's going on in the Trump administration is a tall order. J.D. Vance were the president, I would say yes, what you just described is likely to happen. That the war in Ukraine recedes into the shadows. Yeah, the U.S. will sell weapons to Europe and the Europeans can give them to Ukraine, but we're done. More or less good night and good luck. I don't see Trump as being there at this time. And that's in part, I think, because Trump is a very different kind of person. He's not an ideologue. He's very transactional. He listens to the MAGA movement because that's his political oxygen, but I think he takes it day by day. And I'm guessing that he wants, number one, to end the war so that he can be in the running for a Nobel Peace Prize, and conversely, that he does not want to go down in history as the American president who lost Ukraine. And I do worry that if the United States does walk away, does pull the plug, that the chances go up of a Russian victory. By victory, I don't mean that Ukraine falls to the Russian military, but that you have some kind of economic/political break. And Zelensky falls and some kind of pro-Russian regime. And so if I had to guess, I think Trump is going to stay in the game. And it would not shock me if he, in fact, eventually asks Congress for more money to send weapons to Ukraine. Because I think he's pissed off at Putin. He realizes that Putin has played him. And as a consequence, in some ways, what Putin is doing is counterproductive because he's angering Trump and instead of kind of playing him carefully. A couple other quick points. I think the Europeans are playing Trump very well. It's not pretty to watch, but coming over here and flattering Trump and spending more on defense and keeping Trump in the game is, I think, the right thing to do because Europe is playing the long game, right? Those leaders who have stood up to Trump, like Lula and Modi, they've paid a price for it. And so even though, let's say, the trade deal with the EU, 15% isn't what everybody wanted, it's probably better than the alternative, which is a trade war with Europe and maybe Trump saying, I'm done with you guys. The other point, and I'll end on this, I'm a little bit more worried about Europe than Constanze is. You know, when I look at opinion polls and see in the three big countries, Britain, France, and Germany, the top vote getters, according to the polling data, it's not clear to me that the center is going to hold and that support to Ukraine is rock solid. Putin is in some ways thinking the same thing.
I'm glad you've brought us to this because I really wanted, Constanze, you've just returned from 3 weeks in Europe. You obviously, your life's work has been on Germany, on Europe. How would you capture where Europe is, not only with respect to Ukraine, but on these broader questions that Charlie has raised? Is there a real risk and threat that Europe sort of moves right, and as the consequence of that, it's a whole posture towards Russia and Ukraine really fundamentally changes?
Charlie's right, of course, and I didn't want to speak for too long, and with 5 minutes more, I would have made exactly those caveats. That said, I do think that fear is a very powerful driver of European cohesion, and I also think that the Russians are bad at reading European politics and bad at finally calibrating their pressure. Or to put it more bluntly, the degree of Russian hybrid interference in the big three in Europe, Germany, UK, France, but also Denmark, the Baltic Sea, off the coast of Norway, off the coast of Ireland, is such, right, that even countries that have sort of lived happily in the wind shadow of, say, the pressure that the Baltics are feeling, are now asking themselves whether they need to do more for security, by which I mean Ireland and Iceland. There is a significant shift in the threat perception in national European security debates. Now, it is very easy for the hard right and for their supporters in the MAGA tribe to depict that as a sort of reckless campaign by national security elites and a sort of guns versus butter choice for the electorates of these countries. But the thing is that these hybrid actions are tangible, right? And they are tangible. Let me just give you an example. I was on a train from Bonn to Stuttgart. That's a trip that ordinarily should have taken 3 hours. It took 8 hours because of an act of sabotage to the train tracks in North Rhine-Westphalia. It's not entirely clear that that was Russian sabotage. We've had some cases of left-wing extremist sabotage, although I would always append the question there, the left is not uninterested in what Putin is doing, right? Or at least the extreme left. And the security services have not been shy recently about attributing, and in fact, the Russians have not been shy about admitting what they were doing. While Putin's speaker Peskov has denied Russian responsibility for the drones, Putin has made jokes about them at Valdai and more or less openly admitting that, I think the quote was, "We've had some fun with these drones." That does resonate in European attitudes and in polling. And while Charlie's right that the hard right parties are on the rise, to go from there to actually being in government is still quite a step. In France, you would need early elections, not impossible. In England, same thing, much more unlikely. And in Germany, for now, very unlikely because it's quite difficult for Germany to have early elections. It's possible that the AfD will have the absolute majority in state elections in Saxony-Anhalt next year in 26, which is quite a small state. But that will be a test, and maybe a useful test, for what they're like when they're in government. And again, lest anybody think that I'm minimizing the threat, especially from the AfD, who are in every possible way an aggressively anti-system party and the most radical and most extremist right-wing party in Europe. They published in the summer a 6-page strategy paper that Politico got a hold of. It's in German, but a chillingly succinct and precise piece of political writing. And you can see that the AfD is following it, and that the established parties, including those of the government, the centrist government coalition in Germany under Chancellor Merz, are having a very hard time counteracting this precise execution that we're seeing in the German political space.
So let me pick up on this comment that you've made about there's been a change in the perception of threat across European states. How much is that translating to working across European states, not only the EU, but other configurations to actually meet the demands of that new perception of Europe's threat, not only as a result of Russia's aggression, but also the unpredictability and especially perhaps the unpredictability of the United States? Charlie, do you want to come in on that?
I agree that the threat perception is tangible, and we here in the United States don't feel it. And that's partly just a question of proximity, right? If you live in Germany, you live in Poland, you live in Finland, you are now actively worried about a possible threat. I was in Hamburg a few weeks ago, and somebody told me that wealthy Hamburgers were buying property in other places because they were afraid that the Russians were coming and they wanted to have a place to go. And yeah, we're seeing significant increases in defense spending, including in Germany, where it's important. But the one thing that you also would want to see, which I don't think we are seeing, is deeper integration and pooling of sovereignty on defense and security policy. And that kind of populism that's bubbling up from below that Constanze and I were both talking about, that makes that pooling of sovereignty, that lifting up of security policy to the supranational level harder to come by. And so in some ways, I think that's the big impediment to a Europe that gets closer to what is called strategic autonomy.
So, Constanze, let me also ask you to comment on that, but also, does it have to be pooling of sovereignty? I mean, there's a lot of conversation about different minilateral and trilateral groupings. The UK loves to talk about this because it's not inside of Europe.
Not for me, because I think that that's an impossible standard to achieve. And if that is the standard that we set, then we are doomed to fail. Whereas I'm seeing something quite different. But let me start with what Charlie postulated. I don't think it is impossible to see another version of the security shock, or in fact an economic shock, that would produce what happened when the Russians invaded Ukraine in February 24, 2022, and the Swedes and the Finns decided that they now wanted to join NATO, right? There are a number of countries that are half in, half out, that are having thoughts about this in more or less specific forms. I think first in line is Iceland, which is reopening the discussion over EU membership. And if the Icelanders decide to go for that, I think that reignites a conversation that currently is on a slow cooker in Norway. It's not inconceivable also that other nations who are already members of the EU would ask themselves whether joining the Eurozone might not be a good idea under the circumstances, especially if the next shock is an economic shock. I mean, Bulgaria is in line for joining the Eurozone in 2026. That's already on the rails. But the Swedes, for example, have been having a quiet national debates about this. I think the more likely, barring a really significant shock, which I can imagine, God knows. The more likely model is one where, for example, Iceland, which is in NATO but not in the EU but doesn't have an army, increases its powers of surveillance and cooperation in its sort of by now sort of very heavily populated exclusive economic zone where all sorts of fishy things are going on by adding to its capabilities under its police powers. In other words, buying unmanned submarine drones, you do not have to have an army for that. You can have your Coast Guard do that. Similarly, Ireland has very strict neutrality rules, but also has an economic zones in which the Russians have been doing stuff that they shouldn't. And the Irish are having a hard time understanding what's happening there. So they do have an army, but it's an exclusively territorial army. Their naval capabilities are very limited. They too are thinking hard about what they need in terms of additional naval capabilities. But again, they can do that under the label of Coast Guard. I think the most obvious current model is the renegotiation of ties with the European Union by Switzerland and the United Kingdom, which has been done very pragmatically by both sides and was made possible by the EU deciding to no longer, or to ditch its high-handed our way or the highway, you adopt all of our rules or none approach that it had had for decades. That has meant a rapprochement between the EU, between Brussels and Switzerland and the UK that would have been considered impossible until the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And then let's not forget that we have NATO, right? And NATO right now is turning into it's an Atlantic alliance because the Canadians are still in it, and because we are deepening our economic ties with the Canadians as Europeans. But it's looking like more of a guest room for the Americans, and that if there is an American presence, it will be to maintain influence on Europe, and because we are still asking them to sell us strategic enablers and to give us intelligence. So in other words, there are a lot of things happening that are making the tissue of cooperation denser, below the level of formal, deeper integration, which I think would really require a massive economic or security shock.
I want to ask you, though, another question about the threat perception. Like, what is the perception of threat? I guess there's two questions. What is Europe's perception of the threat, and what is your perception of the threat that Russia presents? Charlie?
The answer to that is yes. And there are plenty of Europeans who take that threat seriously and see the arrival of drones in NATO airspace and Russian aircraft in NATO airspace and the buzzing of Danish airports as, part of this. Here they come. This is more hybrid. It's more asymmetric, but here they come. Do I personally think that the likelihood of an explicit Russian attack on a NATO country is high? No. And that's because I think Russia is having a very, very hard time fighting a war against Ukraine alone. It's been fighting for 3 years, and it is losing, over 1 million if you count wounded and dead. And it's got, 20+% of Ukrainian territory. Do I think Putin therefore says, I really want to go to war against Ukraine plus all of NATO? I don't think the answer to that is yes. So I'm not lying awake at night worrying that the Russians are about to invade Estonia. On the other hand, you have to prepare for a rainy day. And that's exactly why NATO is now going through the paces of force planning and force structuring for that kind of contingency. What I do think is conceivable is Russia screwing around, particularly in those parts of Europe where there are enclaves of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, i.e. in the Baltic area. This is basically going to be the scenario for as long as Putin is in power. And that's one of the reasons I don't think that Trump is going to leave Europe. Maybe there'll be a downsizing. Maybe we'll go from 80,000 to 40,000. But as long as Russia continues to behave the way it has been behaving, I think we're looking at a long-term geopolitical rift between NATO and Russia and a Europe that has been redivided.
Constanze, on this question of threat perception?
In the sort of strategic community of people who read this kind of stuff, The operative document was the two nearly identical draft treaties that the Russians sent to the White House, the Biden White House, and to shape the military headquarters of NATO in Belgium on December 17th, 2021. I don't think the Russians for a moment expected us to sign those papers, but they were a useful declaration of strategic intent, which was Ukraine is ours. We claim Eastern Europe as a zone of Russian special influence. That zone is more or less coterminous with the NATO expansion beginning in 1997, so most of Central Eastern Europe, but ultimately not stopping there because it also demanded a withdrawal of American nuclear forces from Western Europe. In essence, that's an American withdrawal from Europe, full stop, end of, right? And it would presume that all of Europe was the legitimate zone of interest and influence of Russia. It was a non-starter for the Europeans and is not achievable for this Russia, which has significant internal frailties, not least Putin's state of mind and age and health. But what the Russians are trying to do is to create a state of confusion, distraction, delegitimization of existing European governance and representative democracy, and thereby, as it were, gain a foot in the door. That is something of which Europeans are widely aware of, and not just the quote-unquote strategic community, because it is made manifest every day at this point by the overflights, the buzzing, the drones, the sabotage, and the disinformation, much of which is really quite crude. I mean, one gets the impression over the past 3 years that the Russians are no longer trying particularly hard to do things that aren't attributable. And the European security services, including the famously reluctant German services, have become much faster and much more proactive at attributing very quickly.
So it feels like, there are multiple things at play here, but one of the big things is the future of the West. It's the future of the Transatlantic partnership. And the war has certainly put pressure on that. As you look at that broader relationship, how do you evaluate it? What do you anticipate as we look ahead? Charlie, you've written about this. Where are you now? The future of the West.
I would put it this way, that we all face a common threat today, and it's not Vladimir Putin, and it's not Xi Jinping, and it's not Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, it's us. And when and where the war in Ukraine ends will have much less impact on the future of the West than the trajectory of our societies. And a few years ago, I might have said the United States and the United Kingdom are in a contest to see which country is more screwed up. And thank God for the European continent where the center is holding. I can't say that anymore because I don't think the center is holding. I think Europe is 5 to 10 years behind the United States, but we're all suffering from the same deep tectonic shifts. And that is that the onset of automation in the digital age has basically brought down the social contract of the industrial era. And as a consequence, our middle classes have hollowed out, our political centers have hollowed out, and illiberal populists have stepped into the breach. So if you were to say, what's the top question on my mind when it comes to the future of the West? It is, what are average Germans, Americans, and Brits going to do in 2035 to earn a living wage? Because this problem is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Because as AI kicks in, and there are no Uber drivers, and no truck drivers, and no human beings in an Amazon fulfillment center, those angry Americans that got laid off from GM and then moved to Amazon or Uber are going to get laid off again. And until we figure out how to rebuild our middle classes and rebuild our political centers, we in a heap of trouble.
Okay. Constanze, you run a center for the U.S. and Europe. Charlie's just painted a very dark picture that has to do entirely with technology, displacement, rising inequality, distributional effects of a kind of globalization that maybe the West shouldn't have been pursuing. Where are you on the future of the US and Europe, given that it is the name of your day job?
I'm not sure that we had a choice on pursuing globalization, because globalization is an economic fact, and one that has been created not just by government actors, but by economic actors, and including by private citizens who want to go on holiday to Bali. That is also a part of globalization. This isn't really subject to government control and hasn't been for a long time. In dark moments, I find myself very nearly as pessimistic as Charlie. And I am, frankly, particularly worried about one thing that we haven't talked about yet. I actually think that we can outlast the Russians. I really do. I also think that in economic terms, we Europeans do not allow ourselves to be divided. We are peer power to the United States of America, and that it should think long and hard about alienating us when it may need us as allies if it believes that geoeconomic coercion is its preferred tool to use against adversaries like China. So on the security and the trade front, we should keep our nerves. Although I do find the economic and the trade and currency policy of this administration, to put it very carefully, exceedingly confusing. But what I'm really worried about is something else. And that is a third vector of Trump administration revisionism that combines the technology dominance aspiration with a weaponization of the hard right in Europe in the name of freedom of speech. This is the bad speech in Munich, reinforced by the magnificent 7 technology giants who, for reasons best known to themselves, have decided that representative democracy is no longer fit for purpose and that authoritarianism is the name of the game, and that therefore they are entitled to seek allies with similar preferences in Europe, whereas their main goal really is to break the European digital regulatory system. And we would be hard put to counteract a concerted effort by the technology giants and an American administration bent on destroying European digital sovereignty. It's my understanding that the Europeans are thinking about this very hard, but that, I think, is a genuine vulnerability. And it's what I'm most worried about. And of course, you can connect that to the issues of the future of labor, the role of AI and the energy that it demands on the ability of representative democracies to govern themselves effectively and credibly. But I'm not quite willing to give up the fight yet.
There's a huge amount in there. What's fascinating as we kind of come to the end of this conversation is that we've sort of begun with the war, which has dominated the conversation between the United States and Europe for several years now, and come right back home to the changes within Europe, within the United States. What gives you cause for optimism? I mean, not everything's dark, but what, as you sort of look at the United States, you look at Europe, what is it that gives you a little bit of hope? I'll start with you, Charlie.
I'd say 2 things, Leslie. One is that I think we will figure this out, right? If we were sitting around and talking in the late 19th century, we would have had a similarly worried conversation about industrialization and global change and what are our workers going to do, right? They're all moving to the cities and living in slums, and we figured it out. We figured out how the social contract will work, what people are going to do. It just may take a generation or 2 to get there. And so we need to kind of be patient and make sure that in this hiatus, we don't go belly up. I'm actually quite bullish about the transatlantic relationship. And that's because, we are moving into this world in which the arc of history is, for now, bending in the wrong direction. And when Americans look out at the world and say, with whom can we work to pursue common strategic, economic, and ideological goals, there's an obvious answer. It's Europe. And when Europe asks the same question, even with Donald Trump as president, their answer is the same. It's America. And that's precisely why Alexander Stubb and Starmer and Merz and Macron and von der Leyen are doing things they're probably not very comfortable doing, right? But they're holding on to Trump because they're playing the long game. which is exactly what they should be doing. And so I think that, come the end of the Trump administration, NATO will be NATO, American troops will be in Europe, and this transatlantic partnership that came together after World War II is going to survive and thrive.
Constanze, I guess in some ways you have been more optimistic than Charlie, which I guess that's not a high bar to jump over, although we just got some real optimism there. But anything else you'd like to add on the U.S. and Europe?
I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to be more pessimistic. And then I'll try to do a twist on that, which is, look, we are living in a completely unprecedented phase of aggressive systemic revisionism by three great powers: China, Russia, and now the United States. And it is a revisionism that is addressed at domestic orders, the global security order, regional security orders, trade, technology, energy, currency orders. That's extraordinary. It's a wholesale unpicking of the international order that we've lived in, that we were born into. And it is no solace to point out that the people doing the unpicking are pursuing strategies that are ideologically incoherent, that are inconsistent, that are strong but shallow, and that they fired half of the people that they would need to implement their strategies, and that they seem to have a loose understanding of the basic rules of international economics, a tenuous understanding, I should say. Because there is an enormous risk, sort of structural damage, that a single new government cannot redress. We are seeing Labour and the Tusk government in Poland struggling with that fact, and we're seeing the hard right in both countries ticking upwards as a result. That should give us pause for thought. Now, how do I pick optimism out of that sort of very concerning assessment, which I do think bears an enormous risk of governmental and private actor miscalculation, mutually compounding effects of even small developments? This really is what keeps me up at night. But I do think that the world that I was born into was one in which I was told that I would have very little agency as a citizen, and that in fact, I had the luxury of being a consumer of politics rather than a citizen or an actor. That was very much my childhood, my youth, much of my adult life. I think those days are over. And we are now faced with the challenge, the responsibility, which is overwhelming, of having to reinvent the conditions of community. We're in a foundational limit. And if we don't make use of it, we will be present at the destruction. And that's not something I'm willing to entertain for myself.
Constanze Stelzenmüller and Charles Kupchan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for hosting, Leslie.
It's been a great pleasure. Good to have you here on this side of the Atlantic again, Leslie.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Deep Dish on Global Affairs. I'm your host, Leslie Vinjamori. Talk to you next week. Deep Dish is a production of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow Deep Dish on Global Affairs wherever you get your podcasts. And if someone you know might find it interesting, send it their way. As a reminder, the opinions you heard belong to the people who expressed them and not to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This episode is produced by Tria Raimundo and Christina Colon, with support from Marty O'Connell and Lizzie Sokolich. Thank you for listening.